All right. Awesome. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. We want to thank everyone who was able to join us today. This is one in a series of webinars that we've been doing over the last several months. So we're going to start with some housekeeping items. The webinar will be recorded, and we will send out that recording within 24 to 48 hours post today. So you can expect something probably around Monday in your inbox. In there, we will also include a link to our previous webinars. As I said, this has been a series of webinars that we've been doing, and you can see what those were previously, starting with engaging families from day one through practice that promotes family efficacy with learning. So today's webinar is Family Engagement 2.0, Creating Strong Family Efficacy with Technology. And we could not be more thrilled to have Dr. Constantino join us again and to walk us through this topic. For those of you that don't know Dr. Constantino, kind of his work, he is a national expert in family engagement. What I love most about Steve in this sense is that he has had every role you can imagine in education. And throughout each of those has brought his passion for family engagement from a band teacher all the way through to state superintendent in Virginia. So we are honored to have him today, and I think you're really going to enjoy what he is going to talk about, which is an interesting topic. Real briefly, Livingtree is a private social network, and we believe that combination of great technology combined with best practices, which is what Steve's going to talk about today, really can move the needle for families. And I think Steve's going to show you some things that will help you and hopefully be meaningful to you. This is also a webinar where we had some questions asked in advance. So for those of you that sent us your questions, thank you so much. Some of those we will address explicitly as we go through the webinar, and then there's some that we are going to leave towards the end. If you do have additional questions, if you did not submit a question ahead of time, you can do that in the Q&A section. It should be down at the very bottom of your page, and you just click Q&A, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, Dr. Constantino.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, and welcome. I'm really pleased that we have so many people with us. I know we have a number of people who are returning today, and we also have a significant number of new attendees. So thank you for your interest in family engagement. As I share the screen today, let me talk a little bit about what I hope to accomplish in a relatively short period of time with you. And that is to talk about what technology is doing in terms of communicating with families, engaging families, how social media and the use of technology is altering some of our thinking about family engagement. Not that we shouldn't be engaging families, that thinking will never alter, but what might be the best ways to leverage relationships using technology. I think at the basis of our business, we are a human capital business in education. So at the base of our business really is relationships with people. And I actually will address a couple of the questions right off the bat. There several questions came in about what's the best way to communicate with somebody. One of the questions I think was, what's the best way for a new principal to communicate? I think if you're looking to establish a relationship, even though we're going to spend a lot of time talking about technology, that very first interaction or the first time you're introducing yourself to families and communities, those face-to-face opportunities I still think are important. That's not to say that technology can't and doesn't play a role, and we can talk about that. But establishing trusting relationships with families and the students, quite frankly, obviously at your school, are going to really pay strong dividends as you look to helping students do better in school. And of course, the purpose for engaging families in the educational lives of their children is just that. I often say that engaging families for the sake of engaging them doesn't really get us anywhere, but what we want to always do is connect their engagement to their child's experiences and their child's learning in school. So let's get going and kind of go through some, and for some of you who have been with us before, there's a little review, but we'll get to the meat of it here pretty quickly. You probably have seen this before, or if you've seen one of my talks. I love to use this example. These are the Cleavers, of course, the famous 1950s television show. And this picture reminds me of many years ago, I think in the late 50s and 60s, we had a definition of the American nuclear family. And that definition was this: Dad and Mom were married, always married to each other, and never married to anyone else. Mom worked in the home, Dad worked outside of the home, and there was between 1.5 and 3 children, or something like that. And so that definition of the American nuclear family represented, and at that time, about 80% of the families in the United States. Today, that definition represents about 17%. And so not only has the structure of families in our society changed, but so have the methods for engaging people. And it's not just engaging families. I think you could take it to the broader context of engaging anyone with anything. You know, there are people out there spending and making millions of dollars trying to get your attention and trying to engage you with a product or a service. We want to engage you with your children's learning in our schools, and we want to use technology effectively to do that. I also want to make the delineation between communication and engagement, because it is my experience that these two words are often interchanged. And I think there's a bit of a danger in that. I think that communication could be very simply imparting information. As a matter of fact, many schools are very good at imparting information. We send information home, which is called one-way communication. But we also know that to get to engagement, we need two-way communication. We need to be able to close the loop. The standard can be this question, for example, that I often ask in workshops: do families have the same opportunities and the same mechanisms to communicate to the school as we do to them? Is it an even platform? Is it truly a two-way street? And that's when we get to move from communication to engagement. And you'll see the big difference, I think, is one is a commitment. And second, there is some emotional involvement in engagement that, you know, we have, for lack of a better term, skin in the game. I also think it's important that we be reminded of the definition that I use in terms of what does family engagement mean. And I do so because family engagement tends to mean different things to different people. And I like to really just lay it out there and connect it to learning. The degree to which we empower families to be engaged in the educational lives of their children, and that's at the classroom level or the school level, and then the degree to which schools and districts support those relationships to sustain that efficacy. So I like to, this webinar, as the others have been, will use this definition as a starting point for the work and the information that we share with you today. So in the last few years, we've been collecting some data and looking at some research and understanding how is technology changing the face of education, how is technology changing engagement. And what you see on your screen now are pretty staggering statistics, in my opinion, of what has been occurring over a number of years and where things are today in terms of the general public's use of technology. 7 out of 10 Americans using social media to connect. That's a staggering number. Look at the second box. 5% of people using a platform 2005, today 69%. 2005 was not that long ago. 85% of millennials on social media. 78% of adults using social media. 98% of people owning a cell phone. 89% of those people having a smartphone. And I think the most staggering number on this screen is the one in the bottom right-hand corner, where if you 18 to 29-year-olds who own a cell phone, 100%. Those are the people that are knocking at our doors. Those are the next wave of parents. And so while there may be schools and areas in the United States now where technology and cell phone use and social media use is not at these numbers, I can say with great confidence that, within this next cycle of families coming into our schools with young children, there's going to be a significant expectation um, that social media and technology is used in some fashion so that families can be connected with their children's learning experiences in school. So I wanted to share this with you to frame this conversation, to put it in a little bit of a context in terms of why are we having this conversation. I have been doing some work in the last few years on trying to determine can we engage with technology, and the answer is clearly yes. There was a time when technology was communicating, and I think we have now taken it to a new level of engagement. This graph that you see in front of you represents kind of the evolution of social media and technology. We first started seeing texting and text messages in 1992. We saw email as early as 1971, prototypes of email, but the launching of Facebook, the launching of Twitter in 2006, the big change in cell phones, the iPhone in 2007, Instagram, and on and on. You can see that a lot of the significant technology is not that old. I realize that 2004 is 14, 15 years ago. But when you consider, some of these things coming on the scene in 2007 and 2010, things are changing rapidly. And of course, you can see at the bottom that cell phone ownership is up to 95%. My guess would be that in the next 10 years, as that 18 to 28-year-old group moves into further adulthood, that number is going to creep and eventually get to 100%. Our society will get there. The last teardrop that you see to the right hand of the screen represents the school. And so the question I was trying to figure out is, given the technology that is available to schools and given the use of technology, where do schools lie on this continuum? And what I think is that we are about there. I think that we are behind, usually, unfortunately, in the use of technology and in the innovative aspects of technology. I think that there are lots of factors that work against schools, one of them being money, of course. So this presents a bit of a dilemma. We know that we need to use this, yet we may or may not be in a position to have what we need. And maybe what we have is cumbersome, or maybe what we have is communicative and not engaging. There's a number of different categories. Not enough time today to talk about those things, but I thought it was interesting to kind of plot our schools. And this is a generalization, of course. We have schools that are extremely technologically oriented and extremely innovative, and we have them on the other end of the continuum that are lacking basic technology. So it's a generalization, a national generalization, just to give you an idea of the strength and the role of technology. All of the work that I do, again, I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this. Just a reminder, the 5 simple principles is the logic model and the research that I have done over the years to understand the process of family engagement, how family engagement can be implemented in school systems, how can it be sustained, how it can be measured, and how its effect against student learning can be measured. That is the nucleus of the work that I do, the niche that I'm involved in. And everything that you'll see today, consider that this logic model is behind it. And I just wanted to remind you of that as we move through. I've also been thinking a lot in the last several months about the kinds of things that we do to engage families in schools. And so I began collecting information from schools across the country and asking them, tell me all the ways in which you're engaging families, understanding that many schools are replacing communication or interchanging the word communication with engagement. And you'll see as this screen populates, it's populating in a particular way. What it's telling us is that the hypothesis, the question was, what of these things have an impact on student learning outcomes? And what we know to be true now is that much of the work, much of the activity that's happening to quote unquote engage families is not bad. It's communicative, but it has no impact or little impact on student learning. If you look to the left-hand side of this chart, you can pick out, random tweets or school websites or a weekly newsletter. One of the things that shocks audiences often is when I say that I have yet to find any correlation between signing a student agenda book and improved student learning outcomes in school. There's people kind of gasp when I say that. But we have a lot of these tried and true traditional activities or things we think we should be doing that will engage families. Where we need to be, ladies and gentlemen, is over here. We need, and I'm going to explain these things to you in a minute. We've talked a little bit about them before. I'm going to go a little bit deeper, and then we're going to apply it to technology. How can technology? So the question then in your mind, hopefully, is, okay, Steve, those four things, we get it. Now, how can we use? What do they mean? And how can we use technology to have an impact on family engagement? I often get the question, how can technology enhance engagement? Well, technology can enhance engagement when you are in the strike zone of that green circle. And that engagement is going to lead to better student learning outcomes. You can enhance communication on the left-hand side. And as you can see, there are a number of things that move toward the right-hand side of the screen. But I'm going to focus for a few minutes on those things that you see that are now in the green circle. Really is about that third part of the logic model called empowering and efficacy. What is efficacy? Efficacy is the power for one or many to produce an effect on a desired outcome. Family efficacy means that families feel that they can contribute to the education of their children. Let me just stop right there. Families feel that they can contribute to the education of their children. That is a higher standard than giving parents grade information or giving parents information about things that have occurred in school. I often ask audiences, how do you engage someone with something that has already occurred? And the answer is you don't. So what we're trying to do is we want to make positive differences in learning outcomes, specifically for those kids who have always struggled in school. And there's a direct correlation between disengaged families and kids who are having difficulties in school. The trick is, however, they have to believe that they have the skill to do so. And I get several questions about different kinds of families, families who don't speak English as a first language, or socioeconomically disadvantaged families, or families who have low levels of education. How, Steve, are we going to, how can you impact those families? And the answer is you can, but there is some finesse to it. Obviously, there is no cookie cutter approach to these things, and we're going to talk a little bit about that as we get through this. So I gave you that big fancy term earlier about parent academic socialization, and really, to be simple about it, it means that student attitudes about school are shaped by their family's attitudes about school. So what we want to do then is to impact family and influence family attitude and knowledge about school. Their socialization about school has a direct and positive impact on their students' socialization and interest in school. And all of that can be enhanced with the use of technology. One of the examples in this research began many years ago at Johns Hopkins University. Many of you may know the name Joyce Epstein. She is a prolific researcher in our business. And interactive homework was a concept that was tested, has been tested for years and years, in which teachers take a different look at homework and say, you know, instead of having the child read something or do a worksheet or, you know, one of these traditional kinds of homework activities, the teacher then designs an interactive homework design. And again, there's a whole workshop behind how to do this, so I can't get into this too deeply in the few minutes that we have. But the idea is to assign something that engages a family with the homework. And it might be one of the examples I use. I heard in California several years ago. I don't know that this is still correct, but at that time there was a 5th grade science standard in California about teaching kids volume in science. And so one of the interactive ideas was to help families support this notion of volume, which can be a difficult concept, especially for 5th grade students, elementary students to understand. And so you take 2 containers that hold the same amount of water but are shaped differently, and you show that even though they have a different shape, they still hold the same amount of water. A very simple little thing that you can do at the kitchen sink that anybody can do regardless of what language they speak or what education level they have. And so this notion of engaging families with the work, not telling them what happened, not sending them the quiz grade, not having them sign agenda books, but saying be part of the work that we're doing in school. Remember a couple slides ago, they need to know that they have the skill to do the work. Well, if we can keep it simple and we can break it off in small pieces, what we see consistently in schools across the country, any kind of school, urban, rural, suburban, doesn't matter, high school, middle school, elementary school, high rates of socioeconomic disadvantage, low rates, large ethnicity, or it doesn't matter. We see the same consistent results because we know that at the end of the day, families want their children to exceed them in their quality of life. Every family wants that. And so when you tap into that vein, you start to see an interest, and that interest grows and grows. This is really, for those of you who can remember your graduate studies, this is really constructivism at work. I put that down at the bottom there because we are helping kids make meaning of their learning, and now we have the families having a role in helping kids make meaning of their learning. I had the good fortune of knowing Dr. Jerry Bach for many, many years. Unfortunately, Dr. Bach passed away last summer. Jerry, in many ways, was my mentor and somebody who inspired me many years ago to work on family engagement. And he created a process back in the 1980s called the transparent school model. And the transparent school model really was using technology of the day. And technology of the day in 1986, believe it or not, was voicemail. That was about all that anybody had. And again, without going into a great detail because we have a time constraint, Dr. Bach used this idea to share information, share bytes of information. Instead of parents calling the school and leaving a message saying, "Hey, this is Mr. Constantino, I want you to call me about my son," the parents would call and get a message from their child's teacher about what happened in school today, something they might want to ask their child, and then what was coming up in class that week. And so I'm going to give you a kind of a modern day version of that example. So we've been thinking about using technology in family engagement for a long time. And thanks to Jerry Bach and others like him, he really paved the way in getting us to think about this. In the last book that I wrote, I started talking about the transparent school model. This goes back now 4 years. How could the transparent school model then be applied to modern day technology? That was the question that I began to tinker with a few years ago. So what I want to show you, and this is something right out of Livingtree, it really is, it highlights a couple of things. One, it highlights an engagement, and it highlights that communication is not engagement. And this is something that is very simple. It looks complicated, and I know the first thing people think is, oh my gosh, it's going to take time. Actually, it takes you about a minute once you get pretty good at it. There's a process to it. And there is that is part of the professional development work that I do. And I just did a workshop yesterday, and I had 140 or so people in the room. We practiced doing transparent school model engagement postings. I gave the room 15 minutes, and every person in that room was able to come up with one. It is simple and effective. So you'll see here is taking the Livingtree platform. Here's something that a teacher, an algebra teacher might do. Algebra is a very difficult concept for many people. It was for me, quite frankly. So the order of operations, multiplication, division, addition, and subtraction. Here's a teacher breaking that down, and I don't have to know a thing about algebra as a parent. The teacher has given me examples. And even if I didn't understand the example, it still wouldn't impact, because what this post asks me to do is to have a conversation with my child, or at least gives me a question to ask my child, because we know that the only question, most of the time, the only question that's asked in homes is, what did you do in school today? And the answer is always nothing. This changes that question. This allows the parent to say, tell me what the order of operations is, or hey, your teacher wants me to send back what you think the right answer is to this equation. And it promotes that parent academic socialization that we talked about just a few minutes ago. And families, even disengaged families, will begin to participate. Now, they don't participate the first day. It's not like a light switch. But as trust and confidence is rebuilt with those families start to participate, and they participate in a far more meaningful way, because we can't forget that they do care about their children, and that they want their children to exceed them in their quality of life. And then you can see down at the bottom is an example of a parent who said, hey, we did it. Here's our answer, and we're dying to know the answer because we got 30 minutes of extra video game riding on it. So you can have a little fun with it too. This really is a modern day adoption of the transparent school model. There's a 9-step process, research process behind it that we teach in our professional development. And it looks simple, but there is logic to it behind it. And when you do it correctly, you have a great outcome. Last thing I'll say to you, and then we'll take those questions, Gary, is what I think, and again, I certainly am always in conversations with folks and rethinking and pondering these things. But if we're going to use technology to engage, then we need a secure way to do it. I had several questions on, what do I think about Facebook? And I'm not an anti-Facebook person. My problem with Facebook is it's not secure. That, to me, one of the 4 corners of getting this right is a secure area where teachers and families and kids can communicate safely. We have all kinds of issues that we have to make sure that we have spoken for. I think we also have to understand that the technology comprehensively translates 2 ways. And that translation, making sure, several of you asked for questions about ELL families for whom English is a second language, having the ability to translate back and forth, meaning English into another language and another language back into English, has to be part of the equation. There has to be easy mobile access. More and more people are looking at their phone for all kinds of information. You can get a mortgage on your phone. You can do your banking on your phone. You can pay your coffee bill with your phone. And we're going to be accessing school information and engaging and communicating with phones as well. So that mobile access is important. And there also has to be something that's simple. We're seeing in many schools, as teachers are gravitating toward all kinds of apps, parents are now experiencing app overload. and they're giving up. And we're actually seeing now where when we don't have a uniform approach to using technology, we are actually promoting exhaustion and disengagement. Parents are saying, I can't keep up. I've got 3 kids in 3 different schools, and there's 5 different apps to find out what's going on. Forget it. So we have to be mindful of that as well. So I think those are the conditions for technology. I showed you a little bit about the efficacy, how technology can do that, and very quickly went through efficacy for you, and then talked a little bit about families as well. So that takes us to the end. Gary, I'm going to give it back to you. And we answered some questions, but we have time certainly to get to as many as we can.
Awesome. Thank you, Steve. That was excellent. We've had a lot of questions throughout. Just to address one of those, I know we've got a lot of requests for the slides that Dr. Constantino was presenting, so we'll figure out how to get a version of this in the attached to the recorded webinar, so that you guys can have some of this material. So thank you for those questions, and we're definitely listening. We want to make this as useful and valuable as possible. So Steve, to kind of piggyback on the conversation that we kind of left off here around that app overload idea, one of the questions that was sent in is the use of technology potentially decreasing parents showing up. And how do you address both the online and physical presence when it comes to family engagement?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest shifts that we're seeing. And for the last few years, I have been, and as a matter of fact, in the last book as well, I coined the frame invisible engagement. Invisible engagement is engagement that you never see, but you see results of. We know from research that the most powerful engagement that supports student learning probably happening at the kitchen table or in the car or in homes, and is not likely to happen at a school event. So many schools that I work with, and I will admit that I get some pushback and probably get into some trouble every once in a while. But when someone says to me, hey, we want to increase family engagement, therefore we're going to do 3 math nights. I'm not so sure that getting extra people to math night is just simply getting extra people to math night. I don't know how that translates into better student learning, because my experiences are that the people who come to events are the engaged people anyway, or there's nobody there. So I would be less concerned, quite frankly, about physical engagement, coming to stuff, if you will, at school, and more concerned about how we can help promote the skills of efficacy of families outside of school. So much of a student's life is not in school, and we get wrapped around this event thing. We gotta have back to school night. We gotta have math night. We gotta have this night. And again, I'm not bashing them. I think they're fine. I'm not so sure that we should be so focused on those things, and we should be so scared of the fact that much of the good engagement is stuff that we might not see. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think that slide that talks about the low impact and high impact. If the focus is student learning outcomes, then the focus clearly has to be on the things that have that effect, right? All right. So there was another question. There was actually a couple questions around reaching hard to reach families or students who are at risk, doing that effectively and in partnership. What are some strategies that you've seen? And I've heard you talk about this in some of the work that you were doing in Manassas, and kind of that outreaching to families and kind of meeting them where they're at. So
yeah, I think we talk about the golden rule of family engagement. That is, before they'll come to you, you must go to them. Disengaged families lack trust in the schools. Somewhere along the line, they had lost trust in the system. The system, in their opinion, did not serve their children well, or the system was unfair to their children, or for whatever reason, they became disillusioned and disengaged with the school system. And there's no trust. There can be no relationship without trust. So understanding that, There's some work to be done with outreach to families. I'm a strong proponent of home visits. I know I say those words and people, the blood runs from their heads. Not as scary as a notion as people think it is. We've seen tremendous results with reaching out to families, moving things out of schools into the communities. There's no law that says that the monthly PTA meeting has to be in the library or the cafeteria. Making teachers and school information accessible in places that you would never think about, apartment complex. Many apartment complexes have these community rooms. I used to have meetings at Denny's. Quite frankly, Denny's was a hotspot back in those days. I became quite addicted to the Grand Slam breakfast, but that's another story. But I met a lot of people who were intimidated to come to the school would come and have a cup of coffee and talk about some issues or talk about problems that their kids were experiencing. It was good information for me as a principal to have. So all of those things, I think, work to build the trust back. What won't work, however, is if we ignore all those things and we use technology and we think technology is going to be a surrogate for all of that. I don't think that's going to happen. If it does, great, but I don't think so. I think that to rebuild the trusting relationship is going to take a little more than sending an email or doing a post. It's going to be getting people to believe that you do care about their children, that you want what is best, that you are listening to them, and that you have some empathy for their point of view, even if it is antithetical to what we think. It's important to listen to people who don't agree with us. I once heard a businessman say that any business who only listens to the customers who like them will be out of business in 30 days. But in education, we tend to listen to the people that like us. And I don't know that that serves us very well.
Excellent. Steve, there's a kind of a little bit of a follow-up on one of the slides that you had up there around the parent's role in all of this and the parent academic socialization.
Yeah.
The question is how do you help parents understand their role? How do we educate parents to not only rely on teachers to teach their kids, but for them to be advocates in their child's education?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that my opinion, and again, I have opinions that have been debated, so I'll put that out there as a disclaimer. But my opinion is that in order to help parents advocate, what I don't suggest we do is go out and tell them what their job is. I've never seen that work really well with disengaged families. For example, let's say we have an event at school and we have reached out to a family and the family has indicated that they're coming to the event. We believe that they're coming, the event comes and the family doesn't come. We sometimes then judge that family or we make assumptions about why that family wasn't there. And that is what I think is dangerous. And that's why going up to a disengaged family and trying to tell them what their role should be is not going to be received very well. Instead, what I would recommend that I've seen work is we simply start putting them in the role without telling them, which is exactly what we just did in this webinar. They're starting to have conversations. They might not even know why they're having the conversation. I don't know that they're having a conversation and having a cogent thought about, oh, I'm improving my own efficacy skill. I don't think they're thinking that. I think, hey, the school is giving me a piece of information that I've never gotten before. And I'm going to use that. And over time, I think what happens is that you start to see families reconnecting. And once you're reconnecting with them, then we can begin to talk about, what I like to do is once I get a family reconnected and show them the success that reconnection has happened, then I say, this is really going great. Let's try this. And families then start to pay more attention when they see better outcomes for their kids in school as well. It's the same premise. I've talked to, I'm not a social worker, but I've talked to many social workers and many people who work with disadvantaged families. And I was in a conversation a couple of years ago And someone said, Steve, do you know the one word you should, when you're meeting with a disadvantaged, so an economically disadvantaged family, do you know the one word you should never use in the conversation, should be avoided at all costs? I said, no. And they said, the word help. And that, I was momentarily stunned by that, but then it made sense. It made sense that somebody who needs help doesn't want to hear that they need help. I think it's kind of the same idea for this answer.
Excellent, excellent. Steve, we have, for those of you that are writing in questions, we have a lot of questions coming in, and we're going to get to as many of them as we can. There's some theme in some of these questions, so I can, some of these might be a good topic for our next webinar.
Some of the questions we got were all-day workshops, by the way. So, you know, a few of those questions, like, man, I can't answer that question in a minute. Pretty complicated.
I'm going to try to, the best I can, to group some of these. Steve, we've had a couple questions around technology specifically. And so, you know, are there examples of good technology out there that promote two-way communication? This might seem like a self-serving question, but this one was asked in the thread. So I'm happy to take that, or you know, if you just want to talk about that for a second, and I can chime in.
Well, obviously, I think I wouldn't be sitting on this webinar if I didn't think that the Livingtree platform answered those questions. And toward the end of the webinar, I said, here are some conditions I think that need to be in place. I think Livingtree meets those conditions. Not suggesting it's the only one that does it, but you know, that would be my answer to the question.
Absolutely. And if you have specific questions about Livingtree and the tech aspects of what we do, we're happy to follow up with you. I will say that everything that we do in our technology is focused on student learning outcomes. So making sure that when messages or engagement is you know, between the teacher and the family, that there's a level of data that supports that, and there's also a methodology that comes behind that in terms of how we structure our messages and the types of messages that count as engagement. So, Steve, one of the
let me add one thing, Gary, because I appreciate what you said, and let me build on that one more thing, and that is that many times in schools, family engagement is left to a family engagement coordinator, a parent liaison. Somebody has a title with the word parent or family in it, and the school then says, okay, anything that has to do with families is your job. I've talked about that before. As a matter of fact, I want to do a webinar on that someday, because I have a lot of family engagement folks around the country. What we have to do is we have to build the capacity for all staff members to do this work. And so the professional development and the capacity building that I know exists with Livingtree is absolutely critical because we have to understand why we're doing this. Family engagement is not a topic that is covered in teacher preparation programs for the most part. There are some, but not many. We put most of the teachers into our schools without having any information about why family engagement is essential, what good family engagement looks like, and most importantly, how to do it. What excites me about this technology is that we can do all of that, and we can do it far better and far simpler than we could 15 years ago.
Absolutely. Steve, we've got a couple more minutes here, so this is just kind of a little bit of a piggyback on that last question, but one question that came in is, what kind of data, and I'm sure you could run an entire workshop on this topic as well, but what kind of data do districts keep about family engagement? I'll just add on to that. What should be, what could be in terms of measuring?
Most of the time, what I see in building and district strategic plans, they're counting participation. You know, they're looking at 5% increase in participation in the PTA, or X number of people who come to this, or you know, it's really counting heads and saying, oh look, we had more people come, therefore we have more families engaged, and that those two things don't go together. I think the data that should be collected is the kind of data that we are now being able to collect with technology, and that is, how do these relationships impact learning? if I do this, what will happen to my child's reading score? I think we need to take better care of understanding who is involved and engaged with our schools. The example I use all the time is back to school night. People who know me know that I hate back to school night. I've made fun of it for years, and I've made enemies all over the country, and I'm willing to take my lumps because I still think it's a waste of time. But we have hundreds of people flood into a school for a back to school night event. We have no idea who came. We rarely take attendance. We rarely have them sign in. We have no idea, but just that data point, just knowing that, the people who came represented which kids, because what we know to be true is that generally speaking, and again, there are outliers here, but generally speaking, parents who are coming to these events are what we call engaging the already engaged. But we have this false sense of security because if we fill the library or we fill the cafeteria, we're feeling good about ourselves. Oh, look how many people are here. We still haven't moved the needle on disengagement, and as long as we don't move that needle, we're not going to move the needle on the achievement gap either.
Excellent. Steve, there were three questions that came in that are kind of along this same topic. This idea of going to them, the golden rule,
Yeah.
and how to both bridge that trust gap that might exist between the educator or the administrator and in that family. There were three questions around, hey, there's all kinds of things that are involved in, in-person environments. How do we facilitate that? How do we grow into that? Obviously, that is on the left-hand side or the right-hand side of that high impact. How do you facilitate that at a school? What's maybe a first step and then a graduated step?
There is a process to doing home visits. I would not recommend that you just jump into it. And there's lots of good information out there. And if that's something of interest, that might be a future topic. I will say to you, one of the organizations that I'm very impressed with is called the Parent Home Visit Project. I think that's the name. Out of I think California, San Francisco or Sacramento. They are experts at home visits, but there's a lot of information out there. For example, I think when you consider a home visit, you want to make sure that the very first home visit has nothing to do with academics. It has everything to do with personal relationships. Hi, my name is Steve. Tell me about your family. Tell me about. You don't talk about, well, here's my syllabus, and here's the grades, and here's the expectation, and here's the immunizations, and here's what you need to do, and this is the testing schedule, and this is when you have to come to it. Forget it. I think the first meeting should be, hi, I'm really happy to meet you, and talk to me, and then shut up and listen. I think once you get over that, and I don't know that trust is the biggest barrier. I think fear is a bigger barrier. I think there's a great deal of fear about doing home visits that I think is misplaced. I think there's a great fear of families of having educators come into their home, especially if their home, is subpar. I don't know how to say that more tactfully. So they're embarrassed and they don't want the educators. And so there are some issues. And sometimes we have a meeting at the local library, or sometimes we have a meeting at a community room at Walmart. If there's really a reluctance to come to the home. But the whole purpose of home visits, in my opinion, is not to press academics. It's to build relational trust. Again, that's a little bit of an answer, but I hope that it's at least enough to get you thinking about moving in that direction. And if anybody out there is thinking about moving in that direction, thank you, because we see tremendous dividends from that work. And then the technology on top of that, through the roof.
I couldn't agree more, Steve. As a former educator yourself, and having been a teacher, I know the power that home visits can have. And I think we talked about this a little bit once. I think the biggest change happened really in my own understanding of my families and the community that I serve when I did those home visits. So that relationship building piece is absolutely essential. So we have a ton of questions coming in. I know we're coming up at the end of our time together today. I'm looking through these, trying to figure our very last question for the day is really about in an online environment. Do you think the role of technology or family engagement is still a part of that equation?
Oh, absolutely. We're still talking about children, we're still talking about learning, and we're still talking about what it takes to the partnership that it takes. I think that regardless of how we deliver instruction, because let's remember that technology is a delivery model, it's a vehicle, it isn't an end point. I think if we consider that, then we also need to consider that the first and most influential teacher of children are their families. So you put those two things together, and how could you not engage families, even if you are an online school? You know, if you never have a face-to-face conversation and there's no brick and mortar, there still has to be a way to engage families. And again, obviously the answer is going to be somewhere embedded in technology. But to suggest that in an environment that was not traditional, family engagement is less important, I would not agree with that at all. And I don't know that that was the impetus of the question, but I want to make sure I said that.
I think that was the gist of the question. So, well, that is our last question for this webinar. If we did not get to your question, we'll try to do that post the webinar. There was a ton of stuff in here, so we'll announce our next webinar topic here in the next couple weeks or so. I want to thank everyone for coming in. Again, my name is Gary Hensley. I'm the CEO of Livingtree. We've had Dr. Constantino join us today, and we're excited to continue this journey with you. So I hope you tune in next time for our next webinar. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.